because it's a very important topic today on the Politicrat Daily Podcast, the topic of mental health. And with me to discuss that is Dr. David Crepaz-Keay. He is the head of applied learning at the Mental Health Foundation in England. And I want to say a very warm welcome to you, Dr. David Crepaz-Keay. Welcome to you on this edition of the Politicrat Daily Podcast.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Doctor. David, I know that you like me to call you David, so I will do that for the purposes of our conversation and also so the audience understands that as well. Let me just get to the first thing, the Mental Health Foundation, MHF, Mental Health Foundation. What is the Mental Health Foundation, David, and what is it that your foundation does?
So we are a mental health charity or non-government organisation. We've been we work primarily in the United Kingdom, so across the whole of the UK. We've been doing that for a good few years now. We're well into our 60s as an organisation, and we work in policy and research with a particular interest in preventing mental ill health, promoting good mental health, and giving people the skills and resources to support their own and each other's mental health.
That's great to hear. The Mental Health Foundation, MHF, has been doing very good work, obviously, and it's just really great to be able to speak to you about what MHF does and also about mental health. And that is the next thing I would like to ask you, David. What is mental health?
Uh, it's really interesting. When most people talk about mental health, certainly in the UK, what they really mean is mental illness. And I think when we talk about mental health, what we're talking about is that thing that we all have that can be good or bad mental health. Our mental health goes up, our mental health goes down, but it's affected by everything from our genetic makeup to what we had for breakfast, and absolutely all stops in between. So when we're talking about somebody's mental health, that can be their well-being, that can be their stress, that can be certainly affected by their sleep. It can be things like anxiety, it can be things like fears and phobias, it can be panic attacks, and your mental health can be a really good positive thing, and it can be something that if it goes wrong can be completely disabling. And if people are struggling to grasp what mental health means, then one of the easiest ways to do that is to just remove the word mental and think about what health means to you. So when we think about health, we don't just think about a healthy person as someone who doesn't have any illnesses. We think about a healthy person who has a healthy lifestyle, who does healthy things, who looks after their health. And we're really familiar with this idea of being healthy. What we're not really familiar with is this idea of being mentally healthy. And I suppose when we at the Mental Health Foundation talk about mental health, it's very much in the same way that we might talk about just health. So if you went out and asked 1,000 of your listeners how they looked after their health, I can bet you that pretty much all of them would be able to tell you a story. But if you ask them the same question about how they looked after their mental health, I'm prepared to bet that an awful lot of them would struggle to think about what they even mean by their mental health. And some people might even get scared or worried to even talk about mental health. And I think part of our work, and certainly part of my work, is to just remove that sense of taboo that, certainly, I'm English and I come from a background where talking about our feelings just isn't encouraged at all. I'm rapidly approaching my 60s, and particularly men of my generation, we were never encouraged to talk about our feelings. We were never encouraged to talk about our mental health. And so a lot of us don't even have the language to do it. And even when we think about talking about our mental health services, when we in the UK talk about our mental health services, what we actually mean is our mental illness treatment services. And even that makes people just associate the phrase mental health with mental illness. And the biggest challenge I think we all face is to understand that mental health has meaning for all of us in exactly the same way that health has meaning for all of us, and that's where the focus of the conversation needs to be.
I have to ask this. Why do you think it is that there is a taboo and a stigma around mental health and conversations around it, whether it's in England, whether it's the US? Obviously, you're in England and I'm here in the US. Um, but why do you think that is? And why is that perhaps in a way gender based, where it tends to be men and it tends to be more male? Can you talk about what you're offering? What is your offering in terms of what your assessment of that is, why that's happening?
I think it's we have a long history of when we think about mental health, we are thinking about this mental illness, and I'll go even more shorthand and say madness. And I remember when I was growing up back in the 60s, um, my parents used to say to me, if you behave badly, you will end up over there. And the over there was that kind of psychiatric asylum on the hill. And we in the UK, we built our asylums usually alongside our prisons, often on the top of hills, as a kind of as a statement to to people to say, if you are mad or if you are bad, you will end up in this place. And that was part of our social culture and part of our social history. And so anything that encouraged you, if anyone started talking about mental health, what they were actually talking about was madness. And what they were, the kind of undercurrent was, if you are mad, that's where we'll send you. We will send you to that particular place where mad people go, next door to the place where bad people go. And actually we kind of culturally have merged this mad and bad. And so if you're my age, you grew up with those tales, you grew up with those symbols, you grew up with those touchstones that said mad and bad are other, and we normal nice people want to avoid that at all costs. And that's, I think that's what creates the barrier. And you mentioned men, so I think there's an age and generation thing, and I think older people, those of us who were brought up with those messages, are going to be more reluctant to do it. And then you can overlay that with this notion that um, any flaws in your mental health are seen as weakness. And again, classically, men have been brought up to not exhibit signs of weakness. And certainly any kind of discussions of emotions, let alone mental health, were seen as admissions of weakness. And that was not a very male thing to do. Even just kind of crying isn't a men, boys don't cry, big boys don't cry, men don't cry. And that's, that narrative, that message is saying, emotions are something that women have and men don't. And therefore, if you start displaying them or talking about them, you are being a girl. You're being a woman. And even our language, we have those phrases like you're behaving like an old woman. You're behaving like that's girly behaviour. And that kind of, that when it's used towards men is seen as an insult. And hopefully and actually observably, our language is changing and our gender stereotypes are changing, and there shouldn't be any excuse for anyone growing up now to either associate these particular ways of articulating things with a gender, nor should being associated with a particular gender be seen as an insult. And I think the long, that's the long answer to your question. The short answer is, so men were brought up to behave in a particular way, and that particular behavior, those particular ways were strong, silent, and certainly not complaining or discussing your emotions. We don't have, so we weren't brought up with the language or the skills to do it.
And in association with what you've just said, David, also the toxically masculine society that breeds all of this verbiage and this characterizations of women, and and using kind of what is very clearly to me sexist and misogynistic language, assigning that to men as to insult them, as you kind of mentioned as well, which is also a product of this as well. And what happens, I think, is that these toxically masculine things in a very toxic and patriarchal society do create these kinds of layers where men do shut down, and in some cases become violent. So they don't, not only do they not express feelings, but if they don't express feelings, in the absence of that, they express violence and anger, which, which is a very toxic and dangerous cocktail, obviously. So that's the other part of this I wanted to add to what you said. And I just really, I think we both understand that that's an inescapable thing. And one other thing I thought was very interesting is you talked about gender and how that gets assigned in a very misogynistic and sexist way. Is the song, and you remember this song from 10cc in the mid 1970s called "I'm Not in Love." That was one of my favorite songs. And there's that line whispered by a female voice that says, "Be quiet, big boys don't cry." And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, and I remember that line so well, listening to it back in the 1970s. So when you talked about that, that song came right back to me as someone who is born and raised and grew up in England. That song was my favorite song back then. Um, but anyway, I did want to ask you about whether or not depression and clinical depression is tied to mental health, or is it something completely separate and chemical? And can you talk about that if you could, please?
Yeah, you like the complicated question. You make it sound stunningly easy as a question, like I can say yes or no. But it's an I mean, you're touching on some really complicated things. So let's give it a go. Um, all of how we are um, is a combination of our genetic makeup, our developmental experience, our time in the womb, our time as a child, our time as an adolescent, right through to what stage of life we are at now. So, those of us that grew up, and I love your cultural references because that's how I remember that song. And just as you said it, it kind of just, I can almost feel it in my
Yeah.
doing it. So, you and I, we are products of our genetic makeup, which goes back countless generations, and that will have an effect on both our mental health and our susceptibility to depression, in the same way that it will have an impact on our health, our susceptibility to diabetes, to cancer, to cardiovascular disease, and so on and so forth. So our makeup will have an impact on our mental health, but it will also have an impact on our susceptibility to mental ill health. So depression is a mental illness. It's a diagnosable thing. But what's interesting about depression is, and actually pretty much any illness, and this is a secret you might want, doctors might not want getting out, but most illnesses, and certainly pretty much every mental illness, is a sliding scale. And there is a point at which we decide it becomes an illness. And certainly everybody's mood fluctuates. So we all experience low mood, but we have decided when that low mood becomes so disabling that you can't manage it, we call it depression. And we have tests, and we have diagnostic handbooks that allow us to decide when something moves from low mood to depression. But that is a conscious decision. Now, there are biochemical markers, but unlike something like diabetes, and unlike something like cancer, we don't have the absolute given objective markers that say this is now a measurable depression. The way we diagnose depression is that we do have scales, we make observations, and we know that these are tied to things like brain chemistry, and we know that those are affected by they can be affected by trauma, they can be affected by diet and exercise, they can be affected biochemically. So Some people will react to alcohol differently, and that may cause depression. Some people will react to prescribed and non-prescribed drugs differently, and that may trigger depression. In the same way that when we are diagnosed as having depression and a psychiatrist or a doctor prescribes medication for that, then you and I might react differently to that medication. And for some of us, that might effectively rebalance our brain chemistry and treat our depression, and for others of it might not, or for some people it might do that temporarily, and for other people it might be the only fix that they need. But we also know that things like exercise, if you go for a run, if you go to the gym, we know that that releases chemicals in your brain that elevate your mood. But we also know that those effects are very, very individual. So what works for you, what works for me, might be the same, might be different. But what we call depression, we also know will vary from country to country. So in the States, you use DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. In the UK, we use ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases. And they will both have depression in it, but they will be slightly different in what they call depression and how you deduce depression. So actually, if you and I went into a consulting room in the States and they were looking at DSM, and in the UK and they were looking at ICD, we might actually get a different diagnosis. And that's the same person, the same brain, the same chemistry, but a different observer and a different diagnostic handbook. And you and I, the States and the UK have similar cultures. I mean, there are plenty of differences. We really don't need to even try and list them. There are differences, right. But actually, we have a lot more in common than if we then said, well, how would you diagnose depression in some countries in Africa, in some countries in Asia? It would be very different again. And so again, if you and I and someone who was brought up in, say, Japan, if the three of us had exactly the same brain chemistry and sat in front of, our doctors at home and our doctors in other places, we might well end up with different diagnoses.
Wow, fascinating. And one other thing about the topic of depression, it's not something, of course, because there's societal factors that go along with this too, the way the culture is. Again, I mentioned earlier toxic masculinity. You've got institutional racism that factors in on all, sexism and misogyny, all of these other variables that are extremely powerful and very real and present in the societies. And not to mention the history. I think you alluded to that with trauma as well. But there are people, let's just say on a colloquial basis, who will say, oh, you can get out of bed. Why don't you get up and get out of bed? Why can't you just get up? And I've known people, and I know people who literally can't get out of bed. And I think some of the listeners, there may be some amongst the listenership who may have experienced this or know people who have. So my question, David, is when someone says to someone who may be clinically depressed, well, why don't you just get up? Come on, just get up out of bed. What's your answer to someone who would tell someone who is depressed to just quote unquote get up out of bed?
I think we all know it's not that simple. And one of the challenges we have in mental health is that if you were in bed with a broken leg and a plaster cast, we could see that. We could tell what was going on there. And I would hope that you wouldn't go into the room of someone who's up there in traction and say, why aren't you dancing, mate? You'd feel a lot better if you were dancing. You wouldn't dream of doing that. And the reason you wouldn't dream of doing that, well, A, because it's just a daft thing to do, but B, you've got that very strong visual cue that there is something not right there, that there is a genuine, obvious injury. And I think we're not used to this idea that there can be a genuine barrier to doing something, but we can't see it. It's almost like we can't see the depression, therefore we're not quite sure if it's real or not. And we're not quite sure whether someone's might be just kind of, they just need to pull themselves together is the kind of classic thing. Get out of bed, go and do this. Honestly, I don't know anyone who, and I know a lot of people who've experienced depression. I don't know any of them who would choose to withdraw in the way that their experience of depression makes them do. They would all genuinely much rather not be in that really, in bed in that darkened room with those incredibly low energy levels, and they would much rather be having a kind of more enjoyable life. Of course they would. And if it was as simple as just, oh, I hadn't thought of getting out of bed and just going out,
Right.
thank you for that. I don't know why it didn't occur to me,
Right.
what was I thinking? But I mean, let's take something, where it's a little bit more concrete and we can kind of work our way through this. You'll be familiar with seasonally affective disorder, this
Yes.
idea of we call it, it gets called the winter blues, but it's basically depression associated with lower levels of sunlight, with shorter days, and it comes around every year, and there are a lot of people, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the States who experience that. And winter's coming, the days are getting shorter, and yet you still experience that seasonally affective disorder. um, it's not that you want to, it's just that that's what happens. And we know quite a lot about it. We know that it changes your brain chemistry, and we also know that there are some things that make some difference. So people could have light boxes that generate the right kind of wavelength light to boost the serotonin levels to help reduce the impact of that. We also know that actually even in short days, going out and spending time outdoors will improve that mood. It will do that. So actually, if you want to help that person who's experiencing depression, um, then there are constructive things that you can do. And it's not telling them to get out of bed, but it might be inviting them out for a coffee. It might be saying, look, if you fancy going for a walk, we can do that. It might be if you just fancy a chat, we can do that. Because actually that social interaction, if you're stuck in your bedroom, and you haven't got the energy, you haven't got the motivation to get out and do stuff, your friend, rather than just making those glib comments and actually just coming and sitting with you and chatting, that might be the thing that makes the difference. That might be the bit that gets you moving, gets you thinking, and gets enough energy and motivation into your system to actually get out of bed and move. So there are things that you can do for that person, but telling them to pull themselves together isn't it. But being there for them, having that conversation, being a real friend, being a mate, that is something you can do for them.
And in accordance with that, because it just, again, it just really prompts me to ask another question about this before we move on to a couple of other things. um, this pandemic certainly has offered a lot of mental health challenges to all of us, whether we have depression or a form of depression or not. And in accordance with that, you just mentioned about a person coming in and sitting down with someone. Obviously, in this pandemic, I understand what you're saying, and I think the listeners are very clear on what you've just said as well, David. In this pandemic, of course, it's what you and I are doing right at the minute, which is Zoom. And so we are seeing each other on a camera, and then there are a great many people, as you know, who don't have access to the internet, don't have access to a computer, don't have access to any of the technologies that many others of us, such as you and I, do. Their socioeconomic status is most likely different from yours and mine. So, what about in that situation, in a pandemic where you have someone who may suffer from some form of depression? in a pandemic where, we can't really see each other or spend time with each other because of the pandemic, what would you advise or suggest, or what are your thoughts on that, and what someone might be able to do in a situation like that?
First of all, I mean, you're absolutely right that the impact of the pandemic has been quite unequal, and some of us, I've noticed obviously it's had a significant impact on my life, but not all of that has been negative. So I do not miss 3 hours a day commuting into London from where I live.
Right.
I've been married over 27 years. This last year has been the first year that I've had lunch with my wife pretty much every day for the whole year, and that's been nice. Some of us experience has been cushioned by things like that. Yeah, still lots of it's been difficult for me, but when it comes down to it, I've got the kids. I've got a good relationship with my wife, who's managed to, we managed to spend 15 months in the same house without murdering each other, which is fantastic. Well done, her particularly. But it's joking aside, that's not been everyone's experience, and this is what you're touching on. So a lot of people have been connecting socially using digital devices, and that's been brilliant. But we've also a lot of people have been connecting by speaking to each other on the phone, and that's more accessible to more people. You don't get the face-to-face there, but you still get the contact. You still get the benefit of feeling like you're having a conversation with someone. I know people who've taken up writing letters again, sending postcards. So some people have been really quite creative in how they do that connecting. Where we've seen the pandemic bring out the best in communities, people have been looking after each other. They have been knocking on doors and saying hello at a safe distance. They've been doing shopping for each other. And these kind of, but we've seen a huge rise in the use of food banks, for example. So a lot of people are experiencing food poverty for the first time in their life. And I live in a pretty comfortable part of the country where average incomes are pretty high, and we are not like central London. We're not experiencing, we don't have the kind of levels of poverty that I know some people have in some areas. But even so, in our area, food bank use has been, at record highs. But what people who, our food banks have had a really good number of volunteers, people of all ages, and they are doing really good social support work. So it's not, the food is obviously important, it's in the name, but actually what they're doing as well is they're checking people are okay, they're getting medical prescriptions for people, they're having conversations with people, they're just making sure somebody's still alive. And things have been really tough for our medical services, as they have in many countries. But they're still there if you really, really need it. If someone's, if someone is seriously unwell, then obviously there's a much greater risk that will go unnoticed at the moment. But where people have been looking after each other, popping in on each other, just being more aware of their neighbours and who they are. I mean, I know they're talking to some of my colleagues, they've met their neighbours for the first time in the last year. And so it's been difficult, but people have found ways of connecting and supporting each other using whatever methods they can. I think the people we should be worried about is those that may just have gone unnoticed, and I think there's a real risk in maybe in more rural communities, or for people who aren't first language English speakers, who don't maybe have people around them they can have conversations with, people who are experiencing depression that means they're not getting out of bed and nobody's noticing that those people, it may take us some time to find out just how badly they've been affected by it, but we are going to discover a lot of people have been quite seriously affected by that, and it's going to take us maybe months before we discover the full extent of that impact.
Yeah, and also domestic violence as well, not to mention, which is another extremely serious problem, which has been with us forever, unfortunately. And you know, this pandemic, from what I learn and study and read about, has only exponentially put that on the table as well as a really very serious thing that's going on. Um, I do want to close out the last few minutes of our conversation, David, and you are listening to Dr. David Crepaz-Keay of the Mental Health Foundation with me, Omar Moore, here on the Politicrat Daily podcast. Um, to talk to you, David, about wellness. And on the one hand, there's been a lot of time that we've spent in this conversation talking about mental health. But what is the definition of wellness? And what do you think we as a society or as people should be doing to kind of achieve a level of quote unquote wellness?
So this is back to where we started, isn't it? We understand what healthy means, but we don't understand what mentally healthy means. So when I think about wellness and when I think about mental well-being, which is a term that we're becoming increasingly used to using, the first thing we have to do is say that this isn't the same as not being mentally ill. And in fact, you can have a diagnosed psychiatric condition and still be mentally healthy and still be well. And in the same way that you can have diabetes and still be healthy and still lead a healthy lifestyle and still be well, despite the fact you may have an underlying condition. So we put aside the illness first. And then it's really about the kind of way you choose to live your life and being conscious of living a mentally healthy life. And there are some really key components of that. So the first thing is sleeping well. There's if you want to drive someone mad, there are three really good ways to drive someone mad. Deprive them of sleep, send them to war, or send them to prison. And I can guarantee you've got someone you want to drive them mad. Those three things are the most likely way of doing it. So and you know I can't do much to stop people being sent to war or sent to prison, but I can get people to focus very hard on having a good night's sleep. So um, sleeping well is really important for your mental health. It's also actually really important for your physical health. Um, Eating well, uh, exercising, drinking, not over drinking, drinking moderately. I'm talking about alcohol here. You probably can't drink too much water for your mental health, but you can certainly drink too much wine or gin for your mental health. It's about, in fact, again, the easiest way to think of how do I have a mentally healthy lifestyle is almost just to forget the word mental, because there's very little that you can do that is healthy that isn't also mentally healthy. But the key things that you might not think about are social connection. We've talked about it a lot over the program, but social connection is really important for your mental health. The relationships that you have, the people that you trust, the people around you, and making sure that you have those networks, those are the things that really matter, and those are the things that will help you get through circumstances like the last year, 15 months that we've had. We know that the people who will survive that best will be the people who've got good social connections, those who will be able to who've managed to keep sleeping well, who've managed to keep a level of healthy physical activity. There are some specific things that are really specifically good for your mental health, and that's kind of things like connection with nature. And spending time outdoors in green spaces. Now, it's easy for someone like me who lives in the middle of rural England. It's more difficult for me to find a theatre to go to than a green retreat. And we recognise that, again, this is unequal. But any time that you can spend in a green or blue space, when we talk about kind of coastline or waterside as blue space or green space, that's really good for your mental health. And some of it is because it gives you the opportunity to get out of in there and connect with out there. And I think if I were to pick one thing that is the marker of a mentally healthy activity, it's getting out of the inside of your brain and being in connection with the rest of the world. So, even sitting down, looking at your lovely face, 1,000, 2,000, I don't know, 5,000 miles away, that makes me feel happy. That improves my wellness. And when you smile as I say that I can physically feel that boost, and that's something that it's very difficult to measure, very difficult to put your finger on, but we feel it, we sense it, we know it, and that's the kind of things that we can share with each other to improve community mental health. We've talked about the kind of things that can go wrong, and we've talked about how that might be affected by race and gender and trauma and so on. But all of us have the ability to make other people's life more mentally healthy, and sometimes it is just as simple as being there and smiling. Asking the right question and making that time to connect with people. And we've learned over the last year or so just how important that is. And I think it'd be great if we can carry that learning forward into the future as we start to be able to get out and do more things with more people.
Absolutely, and I tell you, this last thing I do want to add to what you've just said, David. Social media to me is not conducive to positive mental health or better mental health. I mean, I think some listeners may disagree, but and I don't know what your thoughts may be on the subject, but I think that there's an aspect of social media, quite a bit of it, and some of it has involved some of the topics that have come up today, that is not very healthy mentally. I wanted to just ask you about that before we wrap things up here.
I think it's what we found. We've looked at this quite a lot, and it's a fact of life. And I think probably the challenge is not whether social media is good or bad. Social media is there. It's how do we learn to use it constructively? And I think I'm old enough to remember when people thought that television was an evil thing, and that
Yes.
society would never recover from television and the impact it had on our lives. And I suspect there may well have been people who said that about the printed word, and certainly you're old enough to have heard it about video games, and to some extent that debate is still going on. They may be good, they may be bad. In a sense, it's a bit like splitting the atom. We can't undo it. It's there now. What we do have a responsibility to is to give people the skills and knowledge and understanding to make the best of it. I can remember working around, posters or posters. Do you remember the Wonder Bra advert?
Yes,
I'm
I
gonna.
do.
This is really check. I don't know how many of your listeners will get some of our cultural references here, but that was a particular image of a particular woman on 20-foot billboards
Yes.
that affected social attitudes and behaviors. So the things that you're talking about with social media aren't new, because some of the body image issues raised by social media, by photo editing software and so on, which definitely can cause harm, aren't new. Them being delivered into your palm 24 hours a day is new, but they were pretty toxic when they were on 20-foot high billboards outside schools, outside pubs, and so on. So the question is not really, are they good or bad, because they're there and there's nothing you or I can do about it. It's how do we make sure that we harness their power for good, their ability to connect people when other things don't, and we minimize their harm. And then we minimize their harm on young people through body image, and they minimize their harm on on those of us working, because we don't switch the damn things off at the end of our working day. So that they create new challenges, but they also keep people like you and me in business. So they're swings and roundabouts.
Very true. Very true. I want to thank you, Dr. David Crepaz-Keay, Head of Applied Learning at Mental Health Foundation in England. It's really been enjoying a pleasure to be able to have you on to give your insights and thoughts about mental health and about all of these very important things. Dr. David, thank you very much for being on this episode of the Politicrat Daily Podcast today.
Lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me. Good luck and do keep in touch.
Will do. Thank you so very much.